Hello, so this video tutorial is going to be how to do a gusset thumb. So what a gusset thumb is rather than just having a hole that the mitt comes out, instead it gets bigger along either edge so that it flows with your finger. So it says in the pattern where to begin, and what you're going to do is essentially every 2 rows, so every other row, you are going to be adding a stitch on either side. So each row you'll add a stitch here and add a stitch here. You'll do normal row, add a stitch, and it'll get larger and larger. And then once you get to the end, you are going to add stitches right here and knit the thumb up. It sounds complicated, but it is really not as difficult as it might seem, and I will walk you through every step. The things you are going to need for a gusset thumb are 2 stitch markers. You will need a tapestry needle, and then you will also need a piece of yarn. It can be any other yarn. I think one that is a different color is best, and it can really be any length. I prefer to have a little extra length versus having it be too short, and I will show you how you use that when we get to that portion of the pattern. The only difference between the 2 gloves is where the gusset thumb is placed. On the left hand, it will be at the end of the round, so you'll knit the pattern, you'll knit the back of the mitt, and then you'll knit the gusset thumb at the end. And on the right hand, which we will be doing in this video, you will knit the pattern, do the gusset thumb, and then knit the back side. So the gusset thumb starts after you have done 1 full repetition. So I have done an entire repetition of the pattern, and I'm now starting the 2nd repetition. So starting back at row 1 of the pattern, I'm going to knit the pattern as normal. And the gusset thumb stitches will be done on every odd row. Even rows will be knit the same as usual. So I'm going to knit the pattern part, and then I will demonstrate the thumb. So I have done row 1 of the pattern here. So I have done the yarn overs, knit 2 together, slip, slip, knit, etc. That will give us the lace pattern. And now I am starting on the back. The way that I have this divided is I have 20 stitches for the pattern here, and then I have the back side divided into 10 and 10 stitches. And you can do this however you prefer. I just find that to be, for me, the easiest way to think about it. So now that I've done row 1 on the pattern and I'm still on an even round, I'm going to start introducing the gusset thumb. So since we are doing the right hand, we are doing this at the beginning. When you do the left hand, you are doing it at the end. So the right hand is here and the left hand is here, but you are doing the exact same thing. The placement is the only difference. So when we are starting the gusset thumb, we are going to start by knitting 1 stitch. And I do continental, but it's the same no matter which method you use. So I've knit 1 stitch, and then I'm going to take my place marker and slip it onto that right needle. So I have 1 stitch, my place marker. Now I'm going to make 1 left. So I'm going to pick up the bar from front to back. I'm going to place it on that needle, and I find it easiest to slip in and then move to the back. I'm going to knit that stitch through the back loop, and I have made 1 additional stitch. After you make the additional stitch, you will knit 2 stitches. So knit 1, knit 2, and I will now make 1 more stitch. So I'll pick up that bar in the middle, I will place it on the left needle, and I will knit it through the back loop. Now I will slide that off the needle, and I will place my next stitch marker. So the way we have this aligned is we have 1 stitch, place marker, you made a stitch, you knit 2, you made a stitch, and you placed your stitch marker. And now you are going to continue knitting the rest of that round. So for the back, the rest of this will just be regular knit stitches. I've started working on the 2nd row. So for the 2nd row, you are going to knit normally. So in the pattern, it's knit 1, purl 1, knit 16, purl 1, knit 1. So I've done that. And now I'm getting to the back side where I have my gusset thumb going. So on even rows, you will simply knit normally. So what I am going to do is knit that 1st stitch, and I'm going to try and make it nice and tight. I'm going to slip the marker, and then I'm going to knit that stitch that I made along with the other stitches normally. So you will knit, slip the marker, knit the stitches, slip that marker, and then continue knitting. So I'm now on row 3. So I have just done the pattern portion that's on the top of the mitt, the one that has the introduction of the twist. So I've done that pattern, and it's now time to knit the back. Since we are on an odd row, we are continuing to widen the gusset thumb. So what we will do is, I push my yarn to the end, I'm going to knit that first stitch, and that first stitch is really the hardest. Try and pull it tight, but even if it isn't perfect, you can still fix it when you are weaving your ends in. So I'll knit that first stitch. I'm going to slip the stitch marker, and then I'm going to make one. So I'll lift the bar up, put it on the left needle, and I will knit it through the back loop. And these can be a little tricky on the smaller needles and with a place marker, but once you get the hang of it, it'll get a lot easier. So I have knit one, I have slipped the place marker, and I've made one. Now I'm going to knit until I reach the next place marker. So knitting, knitting, and now I have reached the next place marker. Before you slip that place marker, and it looks like my place marker has attached itself into the yarn, so I'm going to keep that place marker there, and I'm going to make one before I slip the place marker. So I'm going to pull that bar up, sorry that was out of focus, pull the bar up, I'm going to knit that through the back loop. Like I said, these can be a little bit tricky, especially the one that is at the end. Sometimes it helps to go through the back, sometimes it works to slide from the back to the front. So I'm going to knit through that, and I have now made one. After I make one, I am going to slip the place marker, and just like before, I'm going to continue to knit normally. I am now on an even row, so I have knit the pattern here, and now I'm going to be doing the gusset thumb. So we only increase on odd rows. On even rows, we knit normally. So since we are on an even row, I'm going to knit, slip the place marker, knit until I reach the next place marker, and since we are on an even row, I will just slip that marker and continue knitting. I am now on row 5. I've done the pattern, and it's time to do the gusset thumb. Since we are on an odd row, we are going to do an increase. So I will knit until I reach the place marker. So I'm knitting one, slipping the place marker. I'm going to make one. I'm going to knit until I reach the next place marker. When I get to that next place marker, before slipping it, I am going to make one. And then after I make one, I will slip the stitch marker, and then I will continue to knit the rest of the round. So essentially what you are doing is you first introduce the start of the gusset thumb, and then each even row you knit normally, and each odd row what you are doing is adding 2 stitches. So on every odd row you will knit till you reach the stitch marker, you will slip the stitch marker, you will make one, you will knit till you reach the next stitch marker, you will make one, and then you will slip the stitch marker. And you are going to keep going doing this until you have the specified number of stitches. Different patterns will tell you to have a different amount of stitches that you reach depending on how big the thumb is or what the yarn is, but we are going to be going until we reach row 13. That means that there are going to be a total of 16 stitches in between here. So as you can see now, this is already a lot larger than when we started. Each time you do an odd round, you're going to go up 2 stitches, one on either end. So as you continue to knit, this section will get bigger and bigger. And it can look a little weird, but you are definitely doing it right. And you can see here, it might be kind of hard to tell on the camera, that you are already starting to get this gusset thumb look on each side. It is a lot easier to see here that if you pull it apart, you can see that you started the gusset thumb and then it's getting bigger and bigger each row. So you will continue doing that repetition where on even rows you knit normally, and on odd rows you increase 2 on the gusset thumb. You will do that until you reach 16 stitches, and that will be at row 13. So I'm going to keep knitting, and I will check back in with you when I reach row 13. So we are now on row 13. I have just done the lace pattern, and as you can see, the lace pattern continues even while you add this gusset thumb. So you can see, this yarn makes it a little difficult to see, but you can see that it is getting bigger and bigger. Right now we have 14 stitches between here, and we are going up to 16. So row 13 is the last row that you will do your increase on. So just as we have been doing previously, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to knit that first stitch, slip the marker. We are going to make one, and then we are going to knit until we reach the next stitch marker. We have now reached the next stitch marker. Before we slip it, we're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to make one, and then we are going to slip that stitch marker. And if at this point, if you count the stitches between the two stitch markers after you've done that gusset increase, you can count them and see that you have 16 stitches. If for some reason your stitch count is off, you can do another row, or if you would like your thumb portion to be bigger, if you've got big thumbs or it's for a male or something like that, you can continue to add more rows in between, and that will make the size of the thumb bigger. So I have done that final increase, and now I'm going to finish this row, and then row 14 is where we'll be removing the stitches for the gusset thumb. So we have done our final increase, and we now have 16 stitches between the two place markers. On the next row, row 14, normally you would just knit all the way around and knit normally with a pattern. However, on row 14, since we are done doing the gusset thumb increase, what we are going to do is remove these stitches. So I've already done the pattern portion, and now we come to the gusset thumb portion. So what we are going to need for this is a threading needle, and I put it on a piece of yarn that's a different color. And the one thing that can be a little bit tricky about this is the first stitch. So you knit the first stitch, and then you are going to leave that on the needle. A lot of times it tends to fall if you let it go, but you could always just stick a place marker in there. So you can take the place marker off, and you can put the place marker onto that stitch. That way, even if the needle falls out, you are not going to lose that stitch. So we have all 16, and what we're going to do is we're going to take these stitches and we are going to slip them purlwise onto the thread. This will help us set them aside so that we can knit them for the thumb, and we can continue knitting the rest of the glove. So I'm going to slip these purlwise onto the thread. It's also important that you do each stitch individually rather than doing them all as a chunk. And you are welcome to use a different method to set the stitches aside. I just find that this is the easiest way to continue knitting without it interfering with the pattern or the ability to knit easily. All right, so I've got all 16 on there, so I'm gonna pull that yarn through, and we can also just get rid of that stitch marker. We don't need it anymore. So I like to pull up that left needle so those don't fall off either. So we now have these 16 stitches that will be for the thumb on the string. What I like to do, this won't necessarily happen, but I'm always afraid of them falling off. So I like to take the yarn and just make a loose little knot that I can slip off later, but that I won't be worried about them falling off. So we have our work, and then we have these 16 stitches that are set aside. We'll basically be ignoring them until we come back to do the thumb. So now we have to continue to knit. Originally there were 2 stitches that we started with that went into the gusset thumb. So we need to make up for those 2 stitches so that you have the same stitch count for the rest of the knit. So I'm going to take that stitch marker off and put it back on that needle. So since we need to make up for those 2 stitches, what we need to do is cast on 2 stitches And casting on in the middle of your work is a little bit confusing, but it's not as hard as it seems. You can do sort of like a normal long tail cast on, but this is the method that I think is the most secure and will create not gaps and things like that. So you're going to take your work and you are going to rotate your work around. So we are now looking at the yarn that is attached to the ball on the left needle, which would normally be our primary needle. It's on the left side now. So you can take the yarn and you pull it around and to the back. And this is similar to if you were doing a German short row. So we will push this to the end and the yarn is in the back. We'll then take the other needle that's on this row and we will slip that through and we will pull a stitch through. But we are not going to pull it off the needle. What we are instead going to do is come up and slip that needle onto the needle on the left. We're going to do the same thing with that loop. We are going to knit a stitch, but without removing it from the needle. We're going to pull it up, going through the other side and put it back onto that needle. It's not super complicated. It seems a little weird at first, but it isn't as hard as it seems. So now we are going to turn our work back around. So we now have our needle that is connected, or our needle that has the ball connected to it on the right like normal, and we will continue to knit that row. So you can now see that you have added 2 additional stitches. And when you finish counting this row, you will find that you have 10 stitches on that needle as you did prior, and that there are 40 stitches in the round total. So we have our little gusset thumb hanging off here, and we have our stitches. And as you can see, I did that initial first stitch a little loose, but it's really not the end of the world if that does happen. If you have any little holes or gaps or anything in your work, you will be able to fix those later. So I'm now going to continue knitting the next round, and I will just knit those stitches like I normally would. So I'm going to continue the pattern, and I'm going to knit the rest of this pattern repetition, and then I will knit another pattern repetition. So we have now finished knitting the rest of the mitt, and the next thing to do is to complete the thumb. So what we are going to do for the thumb, you can see here that it sort of pops out from the rest, which makes it pretty easy to knit. We are going to have to get these onto needles. We are also going to have to pick up the 2 stitches that we created to keep the stitch count for the rest of the glove even. And you can distribute the stitches evenly onto needles, or you can distribute them in whichever way is most comfortable. It's up to you, but I will show you how I do it. So I have untied the string, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide these 16 stitches onto 2 needles. So I will do 8 per needle. And this can be a little bit finicky, but you want to pick up the stitch with the needle and pull the thread out of just that one. You can either do them one by one, or you can pick them all up and then pull the thread out all at once. You just want to make sure that you have them properly picked up before you take the thread out. So we have picked up those stitches, and I divided them evenly onto 2 needles. So now we need to pick up 2 additional stitches, those 2 that we cast on earlier. It can be kind of hard to see exactly, but you want to try and look at the stitch row. So you can see that this row here connects to this one, and that this row here connects to this one. So the 2 stitches that we're going to pick up are these middle 2 stitches. Even if you don't do this perfectly, it's not the end of the world, so don't stress too much over it. Just try your best to see which 2 are the ones in the middle. So we're going to do this pretty much the same way that we go about adding a new color if you've done color work. If you haven't, don't be intimidated, it's not that difficult. So you are going to grab your yarn, and what you're going to do is hold the yarn like this. So you have the short tail end and the long end connected to the ball, and then you're going to grab another knitting needle. You are going to go in and find which stitch is on the right. So for me, I can see that this stitch here connects to there. So this will be the next stitch that I will pick up. So I'm going to go into that gap there, and I'm going to pick that stitch up. I'm going to take my yarn and put it on my needle, and then I'm going to pull it through. Sometimes you have to use your hand to get it to go through smoothly. And I'm essentially going to knit that stitch. So now I have one stitch there. I then like to pull my short side of the yarn out to the other side, and you want to make sure that you're knitting with the side that is connected to the ball. And then you're going to find the stitch that is next to that one and pick up that stitch. So I'm going to go into this gap right here at the end of that row, and I'm going to pick that one up as well. The same way, you put your needle through, you wrap it around the yarn, and you knit that stitch through the loop. There we go. So I now have my stitches divided onto 3 needles. I have 18 stitches total for the thumb. If you have a bigger thumb, you might have more stitches, but this pattern, this is what is written in it. So don't worry too much about these being loose. What you can do with the short end is you can tie it into a stitch below it, or you can just make sure to pull it tight and continue knitting and sew the ends in when you finish the project. This is going to be the end of our round. So every time we knit, we're going to go around, and this will be the place that we end our round. For some people, it might be helpful to place a stitch marker there. It just depends on what your personal preference is. So as we're knitting, we also want to either keep the needles on the same section, so the needles stay like they are now, or you can distribute them evenly onto different needles. If you do distribute them, make sure that you put a stitch marker in place so that you remember where the start and the end of the round is. So I'm just going to start knitting in the round like I would normally. So now I have gotten back to those 2 first stitches, and I'm going to knit those. So what I usually do, it doesn't matter if you keep the end of the yarn on the inside or the outside, you're going to thread it in at the end, but to pull it tight, it can be helpful to keep it on the outside. So I'm going to knit that first stitch normally. I'm going to pull that end tight to make sure that the stitch doesn't feel super loose. I'm going to knit the second stitch and do the same thing. A lot of times with these stitches, they can end up being a little loose. As you can see here, mine are not as tight and neat as other stitches normally are. But even if this happens, it's totally okay, because any gaps that might occur, you can fix when you get to the end and you're threading in your yarn. Sometimes I do like to distribute the stitches onto different needles, so I just find that that leaves less gaps. So I will demonstrate how to do that. So I'm going to knit the next round. What I'm going to do is I'm going to place a stitch marker on that needle that I'm knitting with. The thumbs can also be a little bit more challenging than others, just because of the fact that it's such a tiny amount of stitches and you're working with huge double pointed needles. So I'm going to knit 1, knit 2 after I place that stitch marker. I'm going to set that needle aside, and I'm now going to grab another needle and knit onto that one. So I'll knit 1, 2, 3, 4, let's see, 4, if I can get this stitch to actually knit, 4, 5, 6. I'm going to then continue on with the next portion. I'm going in to knit my next needle, and what I'm going to do is I'm only going to knit 6 stitches. Since we have 18, they can be distributed evenly onto 3 needles by having 6 per needle. So I'll knit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then what I'm going to do with these 2 extra stitches right here is I'm going to knit them onto that needle. So I will grab an additional needle for this. This is a total of 5 needles in this temporary moment, so you'll have enough with any double pointed needle set. So I'll knit 1, knit 2, I will drop that other needle, and then instead of switching needles, I'm going to go back to the starting needle, and I'm going to knit 1, 2, slip my stitch marker, 3, 4. So now I have a total of 6 stitches here, 6 stitches here, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stitches here. This can be a little confusing. I like this method because I feel like it doesn't leave as many gaps, but for other people, they might prefer to do it differently. But what you do have to remember is that when you are counting your rounds, you have to stop at the stitch marker. So when you get to the end and you're starting to do the brim pattern, you start the brim pattern at the stitch marker. And even if you make a mistake and you start it before or after, it really isn't a big deal. I have made that mistake in plenty of mitts that I've made, and you really can't tell once you're done. So you are going to keep going and knitting this until your mitt reaches about to your thumb. Some people like their mitts longer, some people like them shorter. I think perhaps I made these a little longer than they should have been. So you want to knit till about where you want it to end, and then you're going to keep in mind that you'll be doing 3 or 4 additional rows. So you are going to take into account those extra rows. So you'll knit till, about here, and then you will finish with the brim pattern. When you finish your thumb, after you cast off, you are going to take that extra piece of yarn that is there from when you added this yarn to do the thumb. You're going to take it, put it on a tapestry needle, and then push it to the inside of the glove. So I'm just going to put it through and pull it out to the other side. Then I'm going to flip my glove inside out. Once it's inside out, I can see here one of the issues that I tend to run into with the gloves are these sort of gaps that form in areas where my stitches weren't tight enough. And this is why I said that it's not a big deal, because you can just fix it afterwards. So what I'll do is with the yarn on that tapestry thread, I will just sew in under that stitch through the next stitch, pull it tight. I will go on to the next stitch, go under one and up through the next, pull that through, etc. And I'm just going to keep doing this through all the spots that I see gaps or that I don't think are tight enough, and you won't be able to tell on the outside. And once you do that, you will have a perfect mitt. Once you have finished sewing in your ends, you can flip the glove right side out again, and then you will have a mitt with no holes in it. This one I didn't really do perfectly, so if you do find that you have holes that you still want to fill, you can always grab more yarn and use it to pull those tight. I feel like we are the ones that are the most critical of our own knitting, and a lot of things that we see as mistakes or things that, we think everybody's going to notice, we are the only ones that notice those. So don't be too critical on yourself about your knitting, and you get better every time you try something new. All right, happy knitting, guys.